This is the Open University.
Twirl around, shiny wet clay. Firm hands will shape it and make it a bowl for your roses. Twirl around, shiny wet clay. Firm hands will shape it and make it a bowl for your roses. To brighten your twirl around, shiny wet clay. Firm hands will shape it and make it a bowl for your roses. Twirl around, shiny wet clay. Firm hands will shape it and make it a bowl for your roses. To brighten your day.
Well now, dearly beloved, here's a question. To what extent are you, independent of the where part, where you are? This is something that fascinates me. As I travel around the world, I find that I'm a different character in different places. I might be a different color from the people around me. I might react differently to thunderstorms. Let's say I'm in a place like Kuala Lumpur that has thunderstorms every afternoon. My last pungent experience in that city was sitting in a cafe in Chinatown with torrents of water thundering on a plastic corrugated sheet above me, while Chinese Malay girls came one by one to pose in a basket chair that was hanging from the ceiling for Instagram. So I had this strong impression of Malaysia with its endless tropical thunder showers, but also the intervention of Instagram, which people had recently been trying to persuade me to join unsuccessfully. You actually sense the software kind of intersecting. The room was full of Instagram pictures, potential Instagram pictures. I'm in Tokyo. I'm in my happy place. The reason I was thinking of leaving this particular video ambient, in other words, not having a narrative, which looks as if it's coming out of my mouth here, or perhaps doesn't, because I deliberately go in for this bad lip sync device. I rather like it. And I begin to notice it now on old films. I was watching a Sherlock Holmes film yesterday, and you could see that it had all been dubbed in post-production, as all films are actually, even to this day, because people like to isolate sounds and have multi-track sound. So you get used to getting room tone, recording room tone, which is simply the ambient sound of a location, and then adding dialogue and voices later, so that you can redo them, get the inflections right, get the timings right. But once you've noticed this, that there isn't perhaps quite exact lip sync or match between expressions and vocal inflections, you sort of see it everywhere. Anyway, are you independent of location? I'm definitely not, and the times I notice the me I become in a new place are obviously the times I've just left one place and arrived in another. There is a psychological dimension to this, that you get into a rut when you live in a place permanently, or for several weeks, or even for a couple of weeks. You have the initial excitement of arriving. First of all, the hassle of jet planes, which are horrible, really awful experience, going through airports, and never quite as awful as they could be. I mean, I haven't really had nightmarish experiences, but just somebody slightly malodorous sitting next to me on my flight from Kuala Lumpur to Tokyo. Yeah, somebody slightly unwashed, and me reading my book of James Thurber. James Thurber's reminiscences about Harold Ross, who was the original editor of the New Yorker magazine. Excellent book, actually, very good. And the flight wasn't turbulent or anything. We managed to take off before the thunderstorms bore down on the city, and it was just very long. It was 6.5 to 7 hours. From the land of endless summer to a place where it's actually winter. Really the tail end of winter. It's grey and a little bit chilly and quite windy here in Tokyo. And I've kind of missed the best of the blossom season, the cherry blossom season. I went, my niece Saskia and her father Yap were in town, and I took them to Nakameguro to look at the cherry blossom, but it had already departed, been blown off the trees, really, so that was a slight disappointment. I missed the Golden Week celebrations and Hanami, which is important for the Japanese. It's funny, when you come from a place with no seasons to a place with seasons, you realize why the Japanese harp on about the change of season and say that they're the only country in the world with 4 seasons. That's something the Japanese like to say, unaware perhaps that in Europe we also have 4 seasons. But there are countries to the south of here, Southeast Asia, down at the equator, which don't have 4 seasons, which have an endless summer. And it is, of course, a Shinto thing to celebrate. Transitoriness is more a Buddhist thing, actually, but a Shinto thing to celebrate seasons, the cycles that seasons bring in terms of fertility. I think that's the important thing that Shinto looks at. Buddhism in Japan is more associated with death, and even this idea that all connection, all involvement is pain. So you just hold yourself back from things. That's very Buddhist. But Shinto is more about sex and regeneration, fertility. I'm living close to a Buddhist temple and a Shinto shrine here in Tokyo, in a very delightful area, very quiet, although it's actually close to some of the major hubs right in the center of the city. But it's typically Japanese in the sense that there are a lot of old people here and old shopping streets which are kind of decaying, running down, and old bakeries run by old ladies who might not be around much longer. It's got a rather charming, faded softness to it. I think there's a kind of feminine or tender-minded. I like to use the phrase tender-minded. That's what you really notice coming back to Japan, just how massively, well, first of all, how massively efficient and rich and clean it is. And you think, gosh, well, this is clearly, first of all, a very gifted and competent nation, very organized nation, and it could be very phenomenal as an enemy. You wouldn't want Japan as your enemy, really. You can understand why other Asian countries have lived at certain points in fear of Japan. There's also this weird contrast between how Japan did act when they were imperial overlords, which was pretty poorly, it has to be said, brutally, and how they have organized their own country, which is with a milky, amniotic kindness and softness. And I always feel this, that there is this outward team spirit and conformity which is very rigid and which gets things done. But then there are these interstitial places in Japan where you can be incredibly free, where there's an incredible libertarianism, simply from the fact that people will avert their gaze, look the other way, act as if you're not there, act as if you're not doing the gaff type thing that you're doing. And that gives you, as a foreigner, immense freedom here. But also as certain types of Japanese person, I think you would have that. I don't know if it's indifference or freedom, but... So anyway, I'm here for 3 months now. This will be my only trip to Japan this year, in 2018, and I'm thinking of using these 3 months to make an LP called Ano Podo Koto Lotto Padnodrome. That's the working title, 25 letters. And I take that word from the Belgian French language poet Henri Michaud, who coined the term to describe his mescaline trips. And it's deliberately clumsy, that word, because it's so long and so difficult to say. Ano podo koto loto padnodram. I'll probably get quite good at saying it if I do use it for the LP, but Michaud really wanted to make a word that was big enough to encapsulate the kind of experiences he was having, but he knew that this would be doomed to fail. It would collapse because it was too long as a word, but also because it couldn't wrap itself around these amazing multi-dimensional experiences he was having on the drug mescaline. So he also tried drawing Baroque cathedrals of impossible architecture, Piranesian architecture. And I like the built-in failure that he was using words, but he knew that words were ultimately inadequate. I'm not a drug person, I don't do drugs myself, but I like to talk to people who have done drugs. So I had a conversation the other day with someone who'd done Ayahuasca, the drug where you have to sort of hang out with gurus in the rainforest in South America and sort of vomit up your guts and then have this most amazing kind of psychedelic experience in which you recenter yourself somehow. And so this person the other day was saying that the insight he got was that everything was energy, and it's just that just our minds that make that turn this energy into a floor or a table or a street, a person's face or whatever we perceive around us. It's all just a flow of kind of mutant and protean energy. I just came across this quote, interesting quote from André Breton. He said, "The man who cannot visualize a horse galloping on a tomato is an idiot." I feel that I don't need to take drugs because I can very readily visualize a horse galloping on a tomato, but it's interesting to go back to the original French. It's a slightly longer quote. Les valeurs oniriques l'ont définitivement emporté sur les autres, et je demande à ce qu'on tienne pour un crétin celui qui se refuserait encore, par exemple, à voir un cheval galoper sur une tomate. Une tomate est aussi un ballon d'enfant. Le surréalisme, je le répète, ayant supprimé le mot comme. Dreamy values having definitively prevailed over others, I demand that we call cretin anyone who still refuses, for example, to picture a horse galloping on a tomato. A tomato is also a child's balloon. Surrealism, as I say, having deleted the word like. That's interesting. I've never heard that definition of surrealism before, that it's a way to steer people towards metaphors rather than similes. It's a simile when you say a tomato is like a child's balloon, but if we say the tomato is the child's balloon, then we get into a kind of surrealism, or it could be a parallel world in which one thing which reminds us of another actually contains and includes the other. I suppose you could say that for things and their opposites too. Things always remind me of their opposites. They seem to be defined that way. There's a kind of suppressed opposite within everything. So, for instance, a very kind person might remind me of a very cruel person. I might think, well, this person is avoiding being a cruel person because they have a cruel person inside them and they want to suppress that. And that suppression, that act of suppression, is important. This is why I think that virtuous people are often some of the worst, the worst people around, because you can see that they're working very hard to suppress a truly awful person. But also, as Milton said, there's no point in being an unimaginative person who simply can't imagine any sins or crimes. It's not really virtue to simply not have the capacity to imagine a bad thing you could do. What is virtue is to imagine and understand the appeal of that bad thing and then overcome it because of a greater value, like, well, I ought to be considerate. If everyone acted this way, I'd be in trouble, and so on and so on. So, yeah, I was thinking of leaving this video ambient and speechless for one reason, because when words are not distracting us, we actually pay attention to background sounds, to colours, to forms, to other things. The photography, for instance, would get more important. There would be a sense of freedom, actually. You'd be free from having me guiding your perception of the images that I'm presenting, the sounds I'm presenting. And you would be perhaps more relaxed, because ambient forms are more relaxed. Speaking of which, Alvin Lucier apparently just played in Tokyo, and I missed him. He played at Super Deluxe. He did a solo set at Super Deluxe along with Aaron Ambachi, or Orun Ambachi, sorry, and some other musicians who regularly play Super Deluxe. I mean, Alvin Lucier is 86 now. I really would have loved to go to that. At least I'm in a city where things like that are happening, and that's really important. There's a lot of high-end culture going on here. Even if I miss it, I want to be in a kind of city which has it going on. I was mentioning Alvin Lucier because I wrote an article for a magazine, a German magazine, about torture, actually. It was all sorts of torture as metaphor. For instance, when you're a musician, you're tortured by background music because you can't switch it off. And so I begin this essay by talking about a trip to Ikea, a real trip I made in which I felt oppressed by the 90s Simply Red type music they always play in Ikea, and I realized suddenly that I could actually use their Wi-Fi signal to pop in my earbuds and play on YouTube some Alvin Lucier. So I found this piece using a magnet to make piano strings resonate, and this produces drones. But the effect was, because I couldn't entirely mask out the Mick Hucknall type music in the background, so as I walked around Ikea, what I had was a kind of an ironic effect, a kind of tragic ironic effect in which the Simply Red type music was suddenly overshadowed by these sinister drones, which seemed to turn the whole scene into a horror film. So I imagined seeing corpses in all the stage sets that they tend to lay out to show your ideal house. Suddenly they became your nightmare house, where a bloody corpse is lying under the duvet. And the staff suddenly all looked very alienated, as if they were about to go postal, and all sorts of horrible scenarios seemed to unfold. Which is weird, because if you listen to the Lucier on its own, it doesn't sound sinister. You simply change the context of what music is. It was Mick Hucknall plus Alvin Lucier that became an utter nightmare. Yeah, but that was a kind of drug experience, I suppose. Even just this schizophrenia, as it's called, of walking around with one sound in your head while another sound is ambient. That's also a kind of metaphor of sound, in a way, and it's also an example of you plus place, how place can define you and how you can struggle against that. I used to write in my diary when I was at boarding school, I vow to be less influenced by school this term. It was important to me to hold myself back from what I perceived as a malign influence of my boarding school. I have a song which goes, "You'll be who I want in the end, and that'll be you." Speech is always rhetorical. That's why escaping from speech might have been a liberation for you, but unfortunately I haven't let you escape this time. I've put this voiceover in there, but you'll be who I want in the end, and that'll be you. I want to change you as rhetoric changes someone. That's the whole point of rhetoric. It's kind of political. It changes the person who's listening, changes what they think and feel, at least temporarily. But that'll be you, because there is this kind of tautology that whoever you become as a result of changing will still be you. It'll just be an altered you. So I was thinking about this when I got asked by Liana in Kuala Lumpur what I would do if I could rule the world. I was thinking, well, it's kind of tautological, it's kind of nonsensical to even imagine that, because if I were able to rule the world, for instance, I said I would get rid of cars and make a kind of monk-like, nomadic, maybe Heian kind of world. But in order for me to be allowed to do that and to prevail on people, I would have to essentially share their values. Although maybe they would then come around to share my values. Maybe this is the way out of this. And I said that since the whole point of political power is to impose new values, impose different values, impose values on people which are not their innate values, then this wouldn't work as an arrangement. They would rise up against me and kill me within a day or two. But on the other hand, and someone objected, why do you want everyone to be like you? It's not so much I want everyone to be like me, but this is the only arrangement I could imagine working, that everyone basically agreed with me inside. But I pointed out that it would be equally absurd to impose difference as a measure, as a standard, just because I like people to be different from me, I force everybody to be different from me somehow, and to be exotic or something. That wouldn't make much sense. It's a bit like, I mean, we do live with these paradoxes, like the idea of if we're a tolerant society, we have to tolerate intolerance, do we? I'm walking around Tokyo, sort of quite clownish as usual. I'm living in a potter's house, a pottery showroom actually, which is only really open at weekends to the public, but is the rest of the time my private lair. And it's changing me and I'm changing it, and it's a continuous metaphor of self-transformation.
This is the Open University.